John Stevens was a man of the land, a seasoned frontiersman who had seen more of the wilderness than most men would in several lifetimes. His skin was weathered by years of sun, his muscles honed from long days of physical labor, and his eyes, always alert, had grown accustomed to spotting danger from miles away. The frontier was unforgiving, and survival meant trusting your instincts. John's instincts had kept him alive for years, but this time he wasn't sure if they would be enough. It had all started when he was approached by the leaders of a small settlement on the edge of Apache territory. They had a mission for him, one that didn't sit well in his gut from the moment they laid it out. The leaders had received word of a young Apache girl, Kaya, who had been living in the wild for months after escaping a group of men who had taken her captive. She was considered a wild Apache girl, having been raised away from any sort of settlement or authority. The settlement saw her as a problem that needed to be solved. They told John that Kaya had been causing trouble in the area, raiding camps, stealing food, and even attacking travelers who wandered too close to her territory. The authorities believed that, if left unchecked, she could spark a larger conflict with the Apache tribe. So they had made up their minds. Kaya needed to be brought back, not for punishment, but to be locked away, kept out of sight and out of mind. John didn't quite agree with their reasoning. He'd heard stories about the girl. She was said to be beautiful, wild, and incredibly skilled in survival. She was not just any girl from a tribe. She was someone who had lived on her own in the wilderness, surviving without the help of anyone. John, with his years of experience, could see that Kaya's wild nature was probably the result of her being thrust into a harsh world where survival was the only goal. But he wasn't in a position to argue with the settlement's leaders. They were paying him well for this task, and as he often reminded himself, he wasn't in the business of making friends. He was in the business of completing jobs. Still, John had his doubts. He didn't like the idea of capturing a young woman who had only ever known the wild, and something told him that the situation wasn't as simple as it appeared. Kaya wasn't a criminal. She was a girl who had learned to survive in a world that hadn't been kind to her. John didn't like being part of what seemed like a mission to break her spirit, but his sense of duty got the better of him, and he agreed to take on the task. John set off on his journey at the first light of day. His path led him into the dense forests and rugged terrain that stretched far beyond the settlements and into Apache territory. The wilds here were unforgiving. Steep cliffs, dark forests, and the kind of quiet that made it easy to feel like you were being watched by something just beyond your sight. The air smelled like pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife. It was a place where few people dared to venture alone, but John had been through worse. As he traveled deeper into the wilds, John began to understand why Kaya had become a ghost in the wilderness. Her reputation preceded her. He had heard stories from those who had crossed paths with her. A girl who could vanish into the trees, a girl who could outrun a man, a girl who seemed to have the whole forest on her side. Some said she was a fierce warrior. Others claimed she had been raised by the land itself. But no matter what anyone said, they all agreed on one thing. Kaya was not to be trifled with. By the time John reached the outskirts of the area where Kaya was last seen, the sun was beginning to set. The light turned golden as it filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. John had tracked enough animals in his time to know how to read the signs of the land. He saw broken branches, footprints, and the signs of a camp that had been recently abandoned. It was clear she was near. He followed the tracks for hours, his senses heightened, always watching for any sign of movement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John spotted her. Kaya was standing by a small creek, her back to him, her hair cascading down her back like a dark waterfall. She was alone, her body poised in a way that suggested she was aware of his presence, even though she hadn't turned around yet. John studied her from a distance, taking in the way her clothes, simple, yet functional, clung to her frame and the bow and quiver of arrows strapped to her back. At that moment, John realized just how dangerous she was. She wasn't some frightened girl hiding in the trees. She was a force of nature. Her every movement was calculated, controlled, and precise. This wasn't a girl who needed to be captured. This was a girl who knew exactly how to survive on her own. But John's job was clear. He needed to bring her back to the cabin that had been set up as a holding place until the settlement could figure out what to do with her. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, breaking a twig under his boot. Kaya's head whipped around, her eyes flashing with a mix of suspicion and challenge. John raised his hand slowly, showing her that he meant no harm. But Kaya was already in motion, her feet swift and silent as she darted into the trees. John had no choice but to pursue her. It was a game of cat and mouse that lasted for hours, with Kaya using every trick she knew to outsmart him. She led him through dense underbrush, over rocky hills and across small streams, but John was determined, relying on his experience to track her, even as she seemed to vanish into thin air time and again. By the time they reached the small cabin where he was supposed to take her, the sun had long set. Kaya was exhausted, but so was John. With one last burst of energy, he caught up to her, grabbing her by the wrist. For a moment, she struggled fiercely, but her resistance began to fade as she realized that there was no escape. John didn't take pleasure in what he had to do. He wasn't proud of locking her in the cabin, but he had a job to complete and he wasn't about to fail. Kaya was a wild spirit, and John couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. He had been in her shoes before, on the run, hiding in the wilderness, desperate to survive, but he had made his choice. As he locked the door behind her and stepped away, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the right thing to do. But there was no turning back now. As the door of the small cabin closed behind Kaya, a heavy silence settled over the room. The wood creaked and groaned in the chill of the night air, but it felt like a world of its own, distant, separate from the wild outside. Kaya stood still, her back to the wall, her breath shallow. Her eyes glowed with a fierce intensity, scanning every corner of the room. She was a caged animal now, but her spirit was far from broken. John stood at the door for a moment, his hand resting on the handle. He could hear her breath quickening as she fought to control her emotions. He knew what was coming. Kaya was no ordinary prisoner. She was a wild spirit who had lived alone for far too long. The walls of the cabin might have confined her body, but her mind would remain free. He didn't need to be a tracker to understand that much. As John turned to leave, he hesitated. He didn't want to lock her in. The idea of keeping her in this small space, away from the open sky and the wild land she loved, felt wrong. But the settlement's orders were clear, and he had no choice but to follow them. He looked over his shoulder, locking eyes with Kaya for just a moment. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of anger, fear, and challenge, that made John pause. He had faced men, wolves, and even bears without flinching. But there was something about Kaya's presence that made him feel uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. He turned away and left the cabin, the key to the lock cold in his hand. The first few hours were quiet. Kaya paced the room, her steps echoing in the stillness. She refused to sit, refused to rest. Instead, she moved like a caged animal, her body filled with nervous energy. John could hear her from the other side of the door. Occasionally, she would let out a frustrated sound, banging her fists on the walls or stomping her feet. It was a sound of rebellion, the sound of someone who had been forced into submission against their will. John didn't know what to expect. He had heard stories of people who had been held captive, stories of broken spirits and defeated souls. But Kaya wasn't like the others. She wasn't broken. She was angry, yes, but there was something else, something raw and untamed that refused to bend. As he sat by the fire outside, he couldn't help but think of the fierce girl he had just locked away. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her, what had turned her into the wild force of nature she had become. Hours passed, and the moon climbed high in the sky. The air grew colder, and the fire crackled louder in the quiet night. John's thoughts kept returning to the cabin. Was she still awake? Was she still pacing the floor, unable to calm herself? He didn't want to think of her like that, like an animal caught in a trap. But the truth was, he had no idea what he was supposed to do with her now. The next morning came with the same chill. John had slept little, his mind turning over the events of the previous day. He stood up, stretched, and began to prepare a meal. He wasn't sure if Kaya would even accept anything from him, but he knew she couldn't stay locked in the cabin forever. He had to try something. As he made his way to the cabin, he could hear her moving inside. The silence had broken, replaced by the sound of light footsteps on the wooden floor. John knocked softly before opening the door. Kaya was sitting in the corner, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. She didn't look at him at first, but he could feel the tension in the air. "Morning," John said softly, trying to keep his voice calm and neutral. Kaya didn't respond. She merely stared at him with the same piercing gaze she had given him the night before. Her hair was wild, tangled from sleep, and her clothes were dirty, the fabric clinging to her from the night's cold. John set down the small bundle of food he had brought. It wasn't much, just some dried meat and bread, but it was something. He wasn't sure if she would take it, but he placed it on the floor in front of her anyway. Kaya eyed the food for a moment, her gaze flicking back to John, then to the door, as if weighing her options. She was testing him, and John knew it. She wanted to see if he would leave or if he would do something different. She had no reason to trust him, and he didn't blame her. After all, he had just locked her in here like a prisoner. John took a seat on the opposite side of the room, giving her space. He didn't want to push her too hard. They both needed time to adjust to the strange new reality that had brought them together. John with his mission and Kaya with her captivity. For what felt like a long time, neither of them spoke. Kaya's eyes flickered between the food and John, but she made no move to touch it. John sat quietly watching her, wondering if she would ever trust him enough to eat. After a while, he stood up, walked over to the small window, and gazed out at the landscape. The vast wilderness stretched out before him, a land both beautiful and dangerous. Finally, Kaya's voice broke the silence. "You're not like them." John turned to face her. Her eyes were still hard, but there was something softer in her tone now. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The others," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones who think I'm just some animal to be tamed." John felt a pang of guilt. "I'm not here to tame you, Kaya," he said softly. "I'm just following orders." Kaya didn't say anything to that, but she finally reached out and grabbed a piece of bread, tearing it in half. She ate in silence, her movements sharp and quick, like someone who hadn't had a decent meal in a long time. John watched her carefully, his heart heavy with a mix of sympathy and confusion. He didn't know what to make of her. She was wild, yes, but she was also human, and no one deserved to be treated like she had been. Days passed and the routine continued. John would bring her food and she would eat it, though always with reluctance. She still avoided looking him in the eyes, still didn't speak much, but every day, she seemed to grow just a little less wary, a little more willing to let him near. There were moments when John felt a strange pull, a sense of connection to this girl who had been locked away in the wilds for so long. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, but Kaya wasn't like anyone he had ever known. She wasn't a prisoner in the traditional sense. Her spirit wasn't broken. But that didn't mean she wasn't hurting. The wild girl wasn't just angry at the world. She was angry at herself, angry for what she had endured, angry for being forced to live a life that didn't belong to her. And, John realized, she was angry at him too, for being part of the system that had put her here. It would take time, he knew. Time to break down the walls Kaya had built around herself. Time to prove that he wasn't like the others who had captured her, who had taken everything from her. But John wasn't sure how long that would take. And in the meantime, all he could do was wait. As the days passed, the space between John and Kaya began to shrink. At first, it was a fragile truce held together by nothing more than necessity. John had a job to do, and Kaya had no choice but to accept the food he brought her, though her gaze always remained distant, filled with mistrust. Yet with each passing day, something was changing. It wasn't obvious at first, and it certainly wasn't something John could easily point to, but he could feel it in the way Kaya moved when she walked around the cabin, in the way her sharp defensive energy began to soften, even if just a little. John could see that Kaya's pride was strong as the wild she had come from. She had survived alone for so long, and it had hardened her. The idea of being confined, even in a small cabin, must have been like a death sentence to someone who was used to the wide open spaces. He could see the fire still burned in her eyes, but he also noticed something else now, an exhaustion beneath that fire, a weariness that came from trying to fight battles for so long, by herself against the world. It was as if her constant need to survive was beginning to drain her, and John wondered how much longer she could keep fighting. John, too, was starting to change. He had always been a solitary man, comfortable with silence, with the rhythm of the wilderness. But Kaya's presence in the cabin, even if it was a strained and uncomfortable one, made him realize how lonely his life had been. He found himself thinking about her more and more. What had happened to her? Why was she alone? What had her life been like before she became the wild girl everyone spoke of? Every question seemed to lead to another. and the answers were always tangled up in mysteries John wasn't sure he would ever fully understand. Still, every morning, without fail, he would bring her food, sometimes a small meal, sometimes just a bit of dried meat or bread. Every time, Kaya would take the food without a word. At first, she barely even looked at him. But one day, when he brought in some water, she finally spoke. "You never ask me what I want," she said quietly, her voice low, yet carrying a challenge in its tone. John stopped in his tracks, surprised. He hadn't expected her to speak, at least not in that way. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm and neutral. "You just bring food. You don't ask if it's what I want. What if I don't want what you bring me?" Kaya's voice was still sharp, but there was something different in it. A bit of curiosity, perhaps, or maybe frustration. Either way, John realized that she was trying to communicate more than just a complaint. "I'm sorry," John said, and for the first time he found himself sincerely apologizing. "I didn't think to ask. I just thought you'd need it." Kaya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the food, then back at John. Her eyes softened just the tiniest bit, though she quickly hid it behind a look of indifference. "I'll eat it," she muttered, picking up the bread. John stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. He had never been particularly good at talking to people, especially not someone like Kaya. His life had been about action, not words. But in this small cabin, with her watching him, he realized that words might be the key to understanding her. So every day after that, he began to ask more questions. Simple ones. Questions about the food she liked, about the places she had traveled, about the things she had seen in the wild. Most of the time, Kaya didn't answer. She would simply stare at him as if unsure whether or not she should trust him. But over time, the silence between them grew less uncomfortable. Kaya's walls, so high and thick, began to show cracks, and John could see it. She was letting him in, little by little. One evening, as they sat by the small fire that flickered in the corner of the cabin, Kaya surprised him again. She had been quiet all day, barely eating, barely moving. But as the firelight cast shadows across her face, she spoke. "Why did you come for me?" she asked, her voice so quiet that John almost missed it. He had to think for a moment before answering. "I didn't come for you, Kaya," he said slowly. "I came for a job. They told me to bring you in, but—" He paused, unsure how to put it into words. "I never thought it would be like this." Kaya turned her head slightly, her sharp gaze locking onto his. "What did you think it would be like?" she asked, her tone now laced with something more vulnerable. John wasn't sure if she even realized she was asking this question, or if she was just speaking without thinking. John sighed. He didn't know how to explain it, but he wanted to try. "I didn't think you would be like this," he said, meaning more than just her physical appearance. He meant her spirit. "I thought you'd be like the stories, dangerous, fierce, untamable." Kaya stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. "And what do you think now?" she asked. John's heart raced. He hadn't expected this conversation, and he wasn't sure where it was going. But something about it felt right. Felt like the kind of moment that could change everything. "I think—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think you've been through things I can't even imagine. And I think maybe I was wrong about you. You're not like the stories." His voice softened, and he said the words he hadn't fully realized he was thinking. "You're not a wild animal to be captured." Kaya didn't say anything for a long time, but she didn't turn away either. She seemed to be considering his words, weighing them carefully. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "I'm not an animal," she said, "but I'm not like you either." John's heart clenched at that. He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't like her, that was true. He had been raised with certain rules, certain beliefs about right and wrong, and he had always followed them. Kaya had been raised with no rules, no laws, no one to tell her what to do. But he could see now that the gap between them wasn't as wide as he had once thought. For the first time in days, John allowed himself to relax. He didn't need to fix anything. He didn't need to make her like him. Maybe, just maybe, they were both learning to see the world through each other's eyes. Over the next few days, their routine shifted. Kaya began to speak more, though she was still cautious. John asked her more about the wild places she had traveled, about the people she had known, about the things she had seen. And with each story, a new layer of Kaya's past was revealed. She told him of her childhood in a distant village, of how her family had been torn apart, of the men who had come for her and taken her away. It was a painful history, but John listened quietly, understanding more with each word. Kaya's walls were still up, but they were no longer as high. They were shifting, crumbling piece by piece, and John, in his own way, was starting to let her see him too, not just as the man who had locked her in the cabin, but as someone who, for the first time, was starting to care. The days continued to pass, and with each one, the cabin became less of a prison for Kaya and more of a strange, quiet refuge. The tension between her and John had started to fade, replaced by something more unexpected, a growing sense of understanding, however tentative it might be. The silence between them, which had once been thick with mistrust, began to feel less oppressive. They no longer felt like enemies, though they were still far from friends. They were simply two people stuck in a situation neither had chosen. John kept his distance, giving Kaya space while also trying to learn more about her. It was as if, in some way, he had stopped seeing her as a wild Apache girl and started seeing her as someone who had been shaped by pain, loss, and survival. Every day, he tried to offer her small gestures of kindness, though he wasn't sure if she was ready to accept them. One evening, as the wind howled outside the cabin, John returned from gathering some firewood to find Kaya sitting in the corner of the room, staring out the window. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Kaya hadn't moved since he had left. He wasn't sure if she had noticed his presence, but something in the air told him that this moment was different. "Kaya," John called out gently. She didn't respond at first, but her eyes flickered toward him, sharp and calculating as always. She was silent for a long moment before she finally spoke. "You think I'm like the others, don't you?" she asked, her voice unusually soft. John froze. He hadn't expected her to bring this up. He had spent so many days trying to figure out what she was thinking, but her sudden question felt like a window into her thoughts, a glimpse into the walls she had built around herself. "No," he said honestly. "I don't think you're like them." Kaya didn't say anything more. She just sat there, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. John walked over slowly, kneeling in front of her. The air between them felt different. Now he could sense her vulnerability, though she didn't show it in any obvious way. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have treated you differently from the beginning." She met his gaze, her eyes challenging him. But there was something else there too, a flicker of understanding, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, he was different from the men who had captured her before. "You didn't know me," she replied simply. John felt a surge of emotion, but he held it back. There was something he needed to understand, something that had been eating at him since he first saw Kaya. "Why were you alone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to your family?" Kaya's face hardened for a moment, her jaw tightening, but she didn't turn away. She was quiet for a long time, and John knew he had to wait for her to speak when she was ready. Finally, she looked up at him, her voice low and full of a quiet pain. "They took them from me," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of years. "The same men who took me. They killed my family, my mother, my father, my brothers. I watched it happen." She paused, her eyes losing focus for a moment, as if the memory was too painful to hold. John felt a coldness wash over him, and his heart sank. He knew the harsh realities of the frontier, the violence, the bloodshed, but hearing Kaya's story hit him in a way that was hard to explain. He had no idea what it was like to lose everything in such a brutal way. She continued, her voice steady but filled with a quiet sadness. "After they killed them, I ran. I had no choice. I couldn't go back to them. I had to survive. That's why I live the way I do." She glanced at him, her eyes hardening once more. "I don't trust people, and I never will." John didn't know what to say. How could he even begin to understand the depth of her loss, the kind of pain she had endured? Instead, he sat quietly with her, not pushing, just offering his presence. For the first time, Kaya allowed herself to sit next to him, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only thing left to do. As the night wore on, Kaya fell into a strange sort of calm. The fire crackled between them, and the shadows in the room seemed to take on a life of their own, dancing in the flickering light. John was surprised to find that he wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, he felt an odd sense of peace, even as the weight of Kaya's words hung in the air. The next few days were quieter than before. Kaya's defenses were still strong, but John noticed that she wasn't as quick to pull away whenever he entered the cabin. She had begun to look at him differently, though she still kept her distance. They didn't talk much, but when they did, it felt like there was less tension in the air. John found himself starting to think of her less as the wild girl he had been ordered to capture, and more as someone who had been shaped by a world that had shown her nothing but pain. He realized that he could relate to that more than he had thought. After all, he had lived a hard life on the frontier too, one that had made him wary of others, distrustful of any bond that might form. But here they were, together in this cabin, two people who had been forced into an impossible situation. It was strange how over time things began to shift between them. John wasn't sure when it happened, but one night as he sat by the fire, something shifted in the room. Kaya was sitting nearby, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes watching the flames. She seemed lost in thought, her mind far away from the present. Without thinking, John stood up and moved toward her, his footsteps soft on the floor. Kaya didn't notice him at first, her attention still fixed on the fire. He crouched down beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth but not so close as to make her feel trapped. "Kaya," he said softly, his voice low. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." At that, Kaya turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were filled with a quiet sorrow, but they were softer now, less guarded. For a moment, they just stared at each other, neither of them speaking. "You're not like the others," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't know how to respond to that. All he knew was that, for the first time, he truly understood what she meant. He wasn't like the men who had taken her, the ones who had destroyed everything she had known. He wasn't here to break her or control her. He was just here, just trying to keep her safe, to keep them both safe, in a world that felt too uncertain to trust. In that moment, something between them shifted. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It wasn't a love story unfolding in a single glance, but it was a bond nonetheless, fragile, tentative, but real. Days later, as they went about their small routine, something had changed between them. Kaya no longer stared at John with suspicion. She didn't pull away when he entered the room, and she began to speak more freely, though only when she felt comfortable. It wasn't much, but it was progress, small, but important. And John? He found himself thinking less about his mission, and more about the woman who had come into his life in such an unexpected way. He knew there was more to her than just the wild girl the settlement had feared. There was something beneath the anger and distrust, a deep well of strength, and perhaps something else. Maybe it was a glimpse of hope, something he hadn't known he needed until now. The days stretched into weeks, and the change in the air between John and Kaya was undeniable. Though they weren't friends and perhaps would never fully understand each other, something had shifted between them. They had both come to terms with the fact that they were stuck together in this small cabin, and they had both, in their own way, accepted it. John had long ago stopped seeing Kaya as a prisoner. Instead, he saw her as someone who had been forced to live through unimaginable loss and hardship. As much as he had tried to follow orders and keep her confined, he now realized that it wasn't the answer. He couldn't keep her locked away, and more importantly, he didn't want to. She wasn't the wild, untamable force the settlement had made her out to be. Kaya was a person, someone who had been shaped by the world around her, just like everyone else. She was strong, yes, but she was also vulnerable, and John could see that now. Kaya, too, had begun to shift. Her walls, once so high and unyielding, were slowly coming down. It wasn't easy for her, and she didn't trust John fully, but she had started to allow him into her world. She shared more about her life, her past, and the reasons she had become so independent, so determined to survive. And with each conversation, with each small moment of connection, John could see the girl beneath the anger and the pain, the girl who had been forced to grow up too fast, and who, somewhere along the way, had lost hope. But their time together was running out. One afternoon, as John returned from gathering firewood, he noticed something strange. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Normally he would have heard Kaya moving around, pacing, or perhaps speaking to herself. But today, the stillness was overwhelming. He stepped inside, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. Kaya was sitting by the fire, her back turned to him. Her posture was different, though, slumped, almost defeated. She wasn't looking at him, but he could sense something had changed. Something in the air felt different, though he couldn't immediately place it. "Kaya," he said, his voice soft but filled with concern. She didn't respond. She simply stared at the fire, lost in thought. John felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had never seen her like this before, silent, withdrawn, her usual fierceness gone. Slowly he made his way over to her, kneeling down beside her. "Kaya," he repeated, this time more gently. "What's wrong?" She turned to look at him, and for the first time John saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected. Fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from being caged or threatened, but the kind that came from knowing something was about to change, and not knowing whether it would be for the better or worse. "I can't stay here forever," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "They'll come for me. They always do." John didn't need her to explain further. He knew exactly what she meant. The men from the settlement, the ones who had ordered him to capture her, were bound to return. They had never truly seen Kaya as anything more than a problem to be dealt with, a dangerous girl who needed to be locked away. He had tried to convince them otherwise, but deep down, John knew they would never let her go. The realization hit him hard. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to do. The thought of handing her over to those men, of returning her to a life where she would be treated like an animal, made him sick. But what other choice did he have? Kaya seemed to read his thoughts, her eyes narrowing as if she could sense his internal struggle. "You're not going to take me back, are you?" she asked, her voice tinged with something close to hope. John opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't answer her. Not the way she wanted. He had a duty, after all. He had to follow orders. He wasn't sure if he could live with the consequences of defying those orders, but, at the same time, the thought of sending Kaya back into captivity was unbearable. Kaya stood up abruptly, her movements quick and sharp. "I won't go back, John, I can't." Her voice was filled with resolve, but there was also something raw in it. She wasn't just talking about physical escape. She was talking about survival. She had survived for so long by her own rules, and to go back to a life where she had no control, no freedom, was something she couldn't bear. "I won't go back either," John said, finally finding his voice. The decision felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders, though he wasn't entirely sure what it meant yet. "I won't turn you over to them." Kaya's eyes widened, and for a moment John thought she might cry, though she didn't. She didn't say anything at first, but her expression softened. She seemed to be studying him, trying to figure out if he was serious. Finally, she nodded. "Then we'll have to leave," she said quietly, her voice firm with determination. "We have to go. As far away as we can." John nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. They didn't know where they would go, or how they would survive in the wilderness, but for the first time they weren't bound by the past. They had a chance to start fresh, to leave behind the ghosts of their pasts, together. The next few days were filled with preparations. John packed up what little supplies they had, food, blankets, and a few weapons he thought might be useful. Kaya had little to bring, but she seemed to know exactly what she needed. She moved quickly and efficiently, as if she had done this many times before. She was a survivor, after all. That much was clear. The day finally came when they both stood at the edge of the forest, looking back at the cabin that had been their home for so long. It had been a place of tension, of quiet conversations and uncomfortable silences. But it had also been a place where they had both begun to heal, even if they didn't fully understand it at the time. The cabin had been a cage, but it had also been a refuge, and now it was time to leave it behind. As they walked into the forest, side by side, John felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had no idea where they were going, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone anymore. Kaya wasn't just a prisoner. She was a partner, and for the first time he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The world outside the cabin was vast, filled with dangers and uncertainties, but for John and Kaya, it was also full of possibilities. The road ahead was unknown, but it was theirs to walk together, and so, as the sun began to set behind them, casting long shadows on the earth, they took their first steps into the future, free for the first time in a long time.